In the heart of Devon, in the quaint village of Sampford Peverell, an information board refers the curious tourist to a now demolished building that had once been known as the Ghost House. The scene of an early 19th century haunting that had shook the walls for several months before falling to a curious silence. The history of the Ghost House told the story of a terrifying haunting. Or did it? It seemed the house had more history to it than the new owners liked to admit. This is Dark Histories, where the facts are worse than fiction. Hello, and welcome to Dark Histories, Season 8, Episode 15. I'm Ben, as always, and this week we got a kind of interesting story, actually. It wasn't going to be this episode. I was doing a completely different episode, and then I couldn't get hold of a source, and it was one that I felt it was really important to get to fact check something, basically, before it went into the episode. And so I benched that episode, and I brought in another episode that I've sort of started in the past and never quite got round to doing. But it's a cracking story. It's a really obscure one. I don't think too many people will have heard of this. So let's get into it. I hope you enjoy it. It's called Smuggling, Riots, and the Sampford Peverell Ghost. In the shadows of Britain's rugged coastlines, a clandestine war has raged for centuries. From moonlit beaches and hidden coves, smugglers, fueled by greed and necessity, have battled with an ever-oppressive crown, who, frequently fighting expensive foreign wars across Europe, were in desperate need of funds. From its fairly small-scale beginnings in the 13th century to its boom in the 17th century, the history of smuggling in the British Isles has been a long, winding path, with more than a few strange stories along the way. Prior to the 13th century, trade was largely local and completely unregulated, and as such, there was just simply no need for a smuggler to exist. By the 13th century, international trade had grown across Europe enough so that the government saw fit to introduce customs duties in order to tax imports into the country, building a network of customs houses in ports across the coastlines that aimed to raise money for the exchequer at the cost of the common man. These new levies presented an opportunity to those who operated in a less than scrupulous space, and so, perhaps unsurprisingly, smuggling was invented and quickly took a strong foothold in the country. For the most part, it was wool rather than luxury goods or alcohol that was the focus of the early smugglers, and since the earliest customs officers didn't actively chase down taxes, it was more or less a pure form of tax evasion rather than any active smuggling. But it would only take a century and several expensive wars before the taxes would be expanded to goods like wine, and the cost hiked several times. Before long, all coastal trade was being taxed as special ports were opened, sanctioning all trade from anywhere else. Fortunately, for anyone seeking to evade these taxes, many of the customs officers, who were poorly paid, were easily bribed, and failing that, the reality was that the coastline is a big place on an island, and there was simply just no way for officials to effectively police every port, beach and cove across the country. A group of men riding the coast on horseback, named the Land Guard, were established in an attempt to stop the flow of lost taxes. But even after it had been expanded twice, it still only consisted of 300 men, and just as the customs officers, they were paid a pittance for their efforts, making them an easy target for a bribe. By the 17th century, new laws were being signed in and introduced on a fairly regular basis in efforts to stifle evasion. At the same time, customs duties were partnered with an ever-widening excise tax that placed a levy on all manner of items, from chocolate to coffee and tea, beer, cider, spirits, leather, soap, and even salt. By the turn of the 18th century, tea was being taxed at a rate of nearly 70%, which, as one can imagine, was most upsetting for the average British citizen, especially for those living in the rural areas who were operating at or near the poverty line, who were seeing the price of goods skyrocketing with no feasible way to pay for them. As the laws became stiffer, so too did the potential profits from smuggling rise, and so, inevitably, this only worked to expand the market for smugglers, who saw themselves experiencing a boom as entire economies found themselves being not only propped up, but actively driven by the illegal practice. At times, the boom was so large that whole communities would see a shift in wealth as cheap goods and well-paid smuggling opportunities made rich men from poor. Nowhere in Britain was this more prevalent than on the south coast, with its proximity to mainland Europe, where a tremendous flow of tea and alcohol flowed into the country at an unprecedented rate. In some of the more remote communities, like the Scilly Isles, smuggling was the only means to gainful employment outside of the seasonal fishing work. Officials were readily bribed, and anyone who opposed the practice frequently found themselves at the sharp end of local ragtag militias who were quite happy to fight to protect their incomes. The situation on the remote isles was so bad that when preventative measures were installed in the 19th century, the entire island's economy collapsed overnight, requiring governmental intervention. The majority of the huge amount of goods that passed through the Scilly Isles, in most cases, found its way to the southwest shores of England, saturating the counties of Cornwall and Devon with contraband. Second only to the southeast, so much of the West Country's industry was seasonal that, like the Scilly Isles, smuggling was a huge boon to the rural economy. Not only involved with the usual imports, the West Country smuggling trade also exported a considerable amount of tin, which would go on to line the cargo holds of ships across the British Empire. The modern image of the smugglers, dressed in striped tops, neckerchiefs and long boots, is a nice bit of folklore. But in truth, most of the smugglers in Devon and Cornwall were just everyday people, from farmers to merchants and even the local officials, with rumours that the clergy were more than happy to get involved. Not that there weren't gangs. Violence against customs officials was commonplace enough that stories of attacks, sometimes even involving murder, often led to a simple shrug of the shoulders by locals who gossiped in the pubs and then later served on the juries to exonerate the accused, either down to bribes or their own involvement with the affected trade. Warehouses could be anything from the storage rooms of general stores to churches, false walls and, like the village of Sampford Peverell, a hollowed-out tree, or even a haunted house. As previously mentioned, the history of smuggling in the British Isles has spawned more than a few strange stories. Situated in the northeast of Devon, 20 miles north of Exeter, Sampford Peverell is a small, rural village with a population of just over 1,000. From the 18th century, like many of the surrounding villages and towns, the industry and economy of Sampford Peverell was largely involved with processing wool and lime, and almost certainly saw a fair degree of smuggling, especially in its wool trade. In 1874, a tree was discovered in the churchyard that had been hollowed out and used for the storage of contraband goods. Whilst being fairly unusual, this was far from the strangest story to come from the small village. John Chaff had grown up the son of a well-to-do local farmer from a large, well-respected family. A sergeant in the cavalry, he had taken up the business of shop owner in July of 1809 when he rented a small 2-storey shop on the outskirts of the village of Sampford Peverell, along with his wife's brother William Taylor, and 2 servants, Anne Mills and the 15-year-old Sally Case. Staples for the village and towns at the time, the general store sold a confused variety of goods for people's day-to-day needs. Raisins and dry fruits, pepper, sugar, fabric, gloves, caps and stockings, thimbles, pincushions, tobacco boxes, inkhorns, manacles and spectacles, pins, knives, knitting needles and curtain rings, primers, salters, testaments, Bibles, shot, candles and soap, turpentine and even oil. It was a true one-stop shop for the local residents. Chaff rented the store from another local man, Mr. Talley, who had agreed on the lease only if John agreed to carry out any building maintenance that had been needed. This was a deal that John had already begun working on by painting the exterior, its white walls brightly in contrast with the dark brown of the thatched roof. Inside the main building, the shop gave way to a kitchen in the rear and housed 2 rooms upstairs, one running directly into the other, divided by a thin partition wall, where John could sleep and entertain. Further apartments attached directly to the house, where the servants and William slept. Everything was perfectly fine for a good while, but slowly some unusual stories began seeping out of the little store. John's young apprentice boy had said he'd seen a sudden apparition of a woman, accompanied by some fairly out-of-place sounds at night, but no serious thought was given to these matters, despite his repeated insistences that something was awry for several months. If John Chaff had been trying to put his apprentice alarm to the back of his mind, it all came to naught in late April of 1810, when more members of the household started hearing and experiencing strange events, one after another. Loud crashes and bangs were heard throughout the house, night and day, and perhaps, more worryingly, they seemed to display some manner of intelligence, as, when anyone stamped on the floor, loud bangs were returned, so violently that they shook the house and sent dust scattering into the air from the old floorboards. In efforts to repeat the sounds and try to work out what could be causing them, John would often hit various floors, ceilings and walls with various instruments, but nothing could ever replicate whatever it was slamming around through the house. The crashes quickly became so frequent and so numerous that before long, rumours were flying around the village that the house was haunted. This wasn't particularly a stretch. Before John had even moved in, there had been some who had suggested it had been haunted before. Lights had been seen in the windows, even though everyone knew that the premises was empty. Mr. Tellamy had tried to stifle the rumours by saying that he'd never suffered anything unusual or untoward in the 2 years that he'd occupied it prior to leasing it to John. But still, it was a small village, and the stories travelled quickly. Soon, John Chaff was inviting members of the village to sit upstairs in the room adjoining the bedroom, where the majority of the disturbances seemed to originate from, in order that they could experience the mysterious knockings for themselves. At times, a dozen or more people packed into this little room, stamping their feet, hoping to generate a reply from whatever it was that was crashing about in the walls and floors of the old store. John would invite them to stamp up and down the stairs, and then delight in the way that the knockings would crash back, seemingly following them around as they walked through the upstairs rooms. If a person rapped their knuckles on the wall, a rapping would return, seeming to emanate from the exact spot initially struck. One evening, when there were several of the neighbours in the house, the bang struck the floorboards so hard and it threw up so much dust into the air that everyone requested John to pry up the floorboard immediately. He dashed off downstairs to collect the tools, returning with a hammer and chisel, whereby he set about prying up the old wooden board. As he slammed his hammer down onto the chisel, the board right next to the one he was pulling up rattled back in reply. Finishing the job as quickly as he could, John lifted the board from the floor and peered into the space below, but found nothing. The mystery of the haunted store continued, and for a good while it was all fun and games, with John happily hosting locals, including 4 members of the clergy who naturally had their own reasons to be interested in a haunted house, for about 5 weeks, before things took a somewhat darker and more sinister turn. The young servant, Sally Case, had been struggling to sleep for some time thanks to the mysterious noises taking place throughout the house for weeks, but soon strange noises were the least of her problems. And she wasn't alone either. All of the servant girls were complaining of disturbed sleep, and worse, whatever it was had taken to attacking them as they cowered in their beds. Anne Mills was struck in the face one night that left a bruise which was compared in size to a turkey's egg, whilst Mrs. Dennis and Mary Woodbury, 2 visitors who came to see the ghosts, both claimed that they had felt an oppressive force crushing them into the mattress, or had otherwise felt themselves struck by what Mary called an invisible hand that had left them battered and bruised the following morning. In an effort to stem the violence, John and his wife allowed the servants to sleep with them in their own bedroom, but even then things didn't seem to let up. On one occasion, John had settled himself in bed for just 30 minutes before the iron candlestick carrying the candle he had just extinguished launched itself across the room, narrowly missing his head. On another night, he was woken by the sounds of screaming coming from the servants' room, and running in to see what was afoot, he saw the curtains of the bed flailing about, violently swinging around in their frame, lit by the moonlight pouring in through the large window. It soon became apparent that most of the violent phenomena was taking place in the servants' room at night, and new vigils began taking place, with people watching over the room all night long, hoping to see the strange occurrences for themselves. On one night, the curtains were said to have made such a noise on the frame, where the metal rings were scraping metal on metal, that John described it as exceeding any sound that could have been produced by 4 people, one on each curtain, each one pulling at the same time. Eventually, the curtains were ripped, so violent was the disturbance. Soon, the force was being referred to as the monster, and Sally was telling visitors that she had tried on several occasions to catch it when it had been attacking her. She said it had been heavy and had felt like a dog or a rabbit in her arms, but had always been too powerful for her to hold it. On another occasion, she had seen a pale image of a man's hand, silhouetted through the sheet as the morning sun had shone through the window on a Sunday morning, while she had been cowering from the oppressive presence. Eventually, news of these events began spreading to the nearby towns and villages, and with it, a new audience came to see for themselves all that was happening, including the local parishioner who took a particular interest in the case. Over 6 nights, he took it upon himself to investigate the cause, so hopeful was he that he might be able to find a solution. Reverend Charles Caleb Colton lived around 5 miles to the west of Sampford Peverell, in the Devonshire village of Tiverton. Educated at Eton and Cambridge, the church ran in his blood, with his father, Barfoot Colton, having been the canon of Salisbury. He'd graduated from Cambridge in 1801 and soon after been presented with the curacy of Tiverton, where he had been in residence for almost 10 years, before the news of what was now being called the Sampford ghost reached his ears. A renowned eccentric, he was known to have had interests most considered fairly unusual for men of the cloth, especially gambling and fishing, and he seemingly spent more time on both than he did preaching. On the nights that he stayed in the house, the Reverend Colton carried out several experiments, including taping his seal across the door frames in order to ensure that no one was sneaking around, room to room, trying to secretly make the scattered knocking sounds. He stood vigil in the servants' room, watching by moonlight, where he tested the strength of the force by placing heavy objects on the end of the bed, and then watched as they were tossed onto the floor. On one night, with the servants still cowering under their bedclothes and in complete darkness, the Reverend placed a Greek folio version of the Bible, which he estimated to have weighed about 8 or 9 pounds, on the foot of the bed, and then watched in awe as again and again it was tossed from the bed into the centre of the room by some invisible force. Every time he replaced the book, it would flip from the bed and slam onto the wooden floor, where the slap would ring in the air. Sending for a candle, he placed the book on the bed and had everyone in the room take note of the particular folds in the bed covers. He then extinguished the candle, and as soon as he heard the book hit the floor again, he relit the candle, and they compared the bed sheets in an effort to prove that none in the bed had moved whilst the lights had been out. All of the witnesses were satisfied at the time that no one had moved. On several nights, the Reverend heard the curtains around the bed violently opening and closing, apparently by themselves, just as John Chaff had described to him. On one occasion, the moonlight through the window lit them enough that he was sufficiently happy that no one had moved them in secret. On another occasion, the curtains were tied open, yet still they were thrown about, and on several occasions he remarked of hearing footsteps which he described like the treading of a man's foot, as if in a slipper. These repeatedly walked by him, back and forth, over and over. On one occasion they even followed him down the stairs by the light of a candle until they moved through the wall into the room beyond. On one of the nights the Reverend Colton was watching over the house, he was joined by Mr. Searle, the keeper of the county jail. Colton gave Searle a tour of the house and then left him around 11:30 p.m, alongside an acquaintance that Searle had brought with him to help watch over the servants' room. Searle was a no-nonsense kind of guy, and throughout the tour he confidently spoke to the Reverend, assuring him that he would get to the bottom of whatever it was that was happening by the time the sun had risen the next morning. As he sat alongside the servants' bed, in which Anne Mills did her best to sleep, despite her spectators, the night crept over the room as the two men sat in darkness. It wasn't too long before the banging started, first on the walls and then thumping into the bed, the two men sitting either side. Mr. Searle placed a large sword, which was usually hanging as an ornament, on the foot of the bed, and then doubling down he placed Colton's large folio Bible on top of that. Carefully watching, and fully expecting one or the other of the sword or the Bible to slap onto the floor, he reeled back in alarm when the sword instead hurled itself 7 feet across the room, slamming into the opposite wall, where it crashed onto the floor. When he returned the next morning, the Reverend Colton noted Searle was visibly shaken, and particularly he was not as confident of solving the affair as he had been the night before. By the end of his vigils, Reverend Colton concluded only that whatever was happening could be summarised thusly: that whatever was attacking the occupants of the house was only choosing to attack the women, and whatever it was severely shrunk back by the introduction of a light to the scene, whereby it would reduce its disturbances dramatically. He later wrote that, with a mind perfectly unprejudiced, after the most minute investigation and closest inspection of all of the premises, I am utterly unable to account for any of the phenomenon I have seen or heard, and labour at this moment under no small perplexity, arising from a determination not likely to admit of supernatural interference. For a reverend not keen on throwing up his hands and submitting to the rumours that the Stamford house was haunted, he came remarkably close. Of course, that was exactly the conclusion that had been reached by many others, including the national press, who had finally caught wind of the story when a reader, signing his name only as JD, wrote to the Morning Chronicle in London concerning what he called a well-authenticated tale of mystery. To the editor of the Morning Chronicle, Sir, I beg leave to trouble you, for the consideration of your readers, with the following very singular but well-authenticated tale of mystery. The inhabitants of a farmhouse at Denham, near Tiverton, Devon, have been lately very much disturbed and alarmed by noises which human reason is incapable to account for. The many reports concerning them induce some persons into the neighbourhood of the first respectability and character to inquire into the circumstances and ascertain their truth or detect the imposition. To achieve this end, they made strict inquiries of the family under an impression that the whole was an imposture. The family, however, all concurring in asserting the truth of the reports, some of those gentlemen have sat up many nights in an adjoining room and are fully satisfied that the singular noises there heard are supernatural. In response, John Marriott, the editor of the Taunton Courier, the main newspaper published in Devon at the time, printed his own piece, furious at the story, which he called so disgraceful to the character of the age we live and so injurious to society in its probable effects on the minds of ignorant and young persons. In this piece, Marriott promised the readers that he would soon produce a witness wholly capable of debunking the affair, which he wrote of in an intensely sarcastic tone. This piece kicked off what was more or less the equivalent of a 19th century Twitter feud between Marriott and the Reverend Colton, who wrote to the paper in an effort to represent the more supernatural side. In his letter, the Reverend suggested that he was done with his investigation, but was keen to continue his search for the truth, and he even made a vague offer of a reward of a considerable sum, which he later fixed at £100, to anyone that could prove the mysterious happenings were a human-made hoax. At the end of his reply, he put forward the name of several witnesses, 3 surgeons, a landlord, and a well-moneyed landowner, all of whom had spent time with the Reverend whilst he had sat in on the haunted house, and had agreed to give their own testimonies should they be asked. Marriott, not keen on being upstaged in his own paper, let loose with his own theories, calling John Chaff a huckster and including a testimony from an undercover correspondent who had visited the house under the guise of a normal local, hoping to experience the mysterious haunting for themselves. Whilst there, they had discovered that there was a considerable partition under the floor of the room next door, which John Chaff apparently hadn't known about before. Later, Marriott bought up the house's previous occupier and their less than legitimate strand of business. The house, occupied by Chaff, the huckster of Sampford Peverell near Tiverton, formerly belonged to a Mrs. Bellamy, a successful dealer in almost every article of food and raiment, from a pennyworth of cheese to a rich brocade. The premises were formerly used as a receptacle for smuggled commodities, and the Mrs. Bellamy, above mentioned, from a capital originally very small and by efforts of the utmost economy, succeeded in realising a very large property by trading for a small profit in contraband goods. Over the following 2 weeks, Marriott continued to accuse Chaff, suggesting that he'd been assisted in the hoax by his wife and brother, Sally the servant girl, and even their neighbour, a cooper named James Dodge. Dodge, he said, had been seen sneaking about the house by the house's landlord, Mr. Tellamy, upon his visit, and he alluded to secret passages, allowing Dodge to show up in suspicious locations, just as the mysterious bangings were supposed to be happening. Mr. Tellamy reportedly found a mop in the servant's bedroom, which he believed to have been used to make the banging sounds on the walls. Marriott also uncovered the fact that Chaff's brother-in-law, William Taylor, who slept in the room next to the servants, had trained under a well-known illusionist and conjurer named Mr. Moon, where he learnt the various arts of necromancy, from the occult exercise of telling the thoughts of people to the simple contrivance of shaking bed curtains. Marriott's language was nothing if not inflammatory, and his clear hatred of superstition was laid out plainly in his writing for all to see. The arguments continued like this, backwards and forwards, for several weeks, as Marriott continued to accuse Chaff, and Chaff hit back, saying that he had no reason to lie about anything, and that he had actually been losing money due to the rumours, as no one was visiting his shop after dark anymore. Eventually, Reverend Colton published a 26-page pamphlet in which he gave his own side of the story, detailing all of the events that had taken place at the house that he had personally witnessed. Naturally, Marriott then did the same, reiterating and reprinting his own arguments, fighting the side for the rationalists and calling the events at Sampford Peverell knavery and folly. All this bickering eventually led John Chaff, his brother William Taylor, James Dodge and the servant girl Sally Case to pay a visit to the mayor of Tiverton in order to have him witness their signing of the following affidavit: that they are entirely ignorant of the cause of all those extraordinary circumstances that have and are occurring at the house of Mr. Chaff in the parish of Sampford. Also, that they have never made in or on any part of the premises any sounds or noises by day or night, by blows or knocking, either with or without an instrument, in order to induce any one human being whatever to believe or even to think that there was anything unaccountable or supernatural in that house. Also, that they have never requested any other person so to do, and that they firmly believe no such attempts have been made by others. Also, that if such attempts have been made, it was without their knowledge or consent. Also, that they have repeatedly heard in midday most violent and loud noises in their house, when numerous persons have been assembled, some in the upper and some in the lower apartments at the same time, and all of them anxious and eager to discover the cause. Also, that the marks on the ceiling have been made by persons trying, but in vain, to imitate the same sounds. Also, that to the best of their knowledge and belief, there are no subterraneous passages in or about the house. Not content to let Marriott have the last word, the Reverend Colton then produced a second pamphlet, this time spanning 28 pages, in which he meticulously pulled apart Marriott's arguments, more or less line by line. The rebuttal seemed to have little effect, however, as by now the public by and large saw the whole affair as nothing more than a hoax, though no motive was ever seriously pursued. In October, a comedy play premiered in London, using the story as material and sending up the whole thing as nothing more than light entertainment, as the city dwellers had a good laugh at the expense of the old-fashioned rural folk, whose superstitions they had, apparently long since discarded. It was the last time that the affair was published in a newspaper. Unfortunately, for John Chaff, it would not be the last time that his name would make it to print. More than 5 months had passed since any mention of the Sampford ghost had appeared in any newspaper, and things appeared to be calming down in the village. Life had more or less returned to normal, and on Monday the 22nd of April, 1811, the biggest news to speak about was the cattle fair that was taking place in the village centre. The fair was always a bustling day for the village, but on this particular day it was especially busy thanks to the recent addition of labourers to the temporary population who were working on digging out a new canal. The construction of the Grand Western Canal had got underway in 1810 after more than 40 years of planning, where surveys plotted a route that would eventually link the Bristol Channel with the English Channel, where ships could transport limestone and coal whilst alleviating the hazard of coastal travel. In Sampford Peverell, the canal cut straight through the centre of the village, splitting it in two, leading to the village needing a pair of road bridges. More galling to the locals, however, was the fact that it ploughed straight through the middle of the churchyard, taking half the church with it. The labourers, referred to at the time as navvies, had gathered that Saturday before the fair in Wellington, 13 miles to the east of Sampford Peverell, in order to exchange their wage tokens. Navvies were frequently paid in tokens or company scrips that were valid to be exchanged for goods and food in the local shops. Usually, also, company-owned, and with marked-up prices due to the monopoly that they had over the custom. Depending on the shop owner's discretion, some were valid in non-company-owned shops, but not all shop owners were so keen to take them in lieu of payment, which appeared to be the situation for the men digging out the canal. Already emotionally charged, the men had spent most of the weekend getting drunk and kicking up a fuss wherever they went, and the cattle fair at Sampford Peverell offered up the perfect opportunity for another day's heavy drinking. By evening, almost 300 labourers had gathered in the village, drunk, angry, and looking to let off some steam, which they did by essentially forming a riot. The sight of John Chaff, by now something of a local celebrity thanks to the Sampford Ghost Affair, and one that was not particularly well presented either, was like red rag to a bull. When a group of labourers spotted him on the road, travelling home in a horse-drawn cart, the crowd began chasing him down, hurling insults and launching rocks at the cart. When Chaff reached his house, he sprinted from the car and into his front door, which he locked behind him. Not content with losing the race, the men took to hurling rocks through the windows and beating the cart driver. Fearful for his life, Chaff took a pistol and fired it through the broken window at the mob, hitting one of the labourers, a man named George Helps, and killing him on the spot. A second shot fired, injuring a second man before the crowd was able to be dispersed. The Taunton Courier reported on the riot, calling the mob a savage, ungovernable banditti, and wasted no time on taking a side in the violence. Let Mr. Chaff's conduct have been ever so criminal, it will form not a shadow of excuse for the daring outrage of which these men have been guilty. The fate of their companions is of their own seeking, and to their conduct it is alone to be attributed. Chaff has acted as most men would have done in defence of their home, nor will or ought the law to injure a hair of his head for the vigorous resistance he made to this attack. It is most extraordinary circumstance that the whole neighbourhood should have been kept in a state of the greatest terror and commotion for more than 24 hours, and no efforts of the police or military made to quell the tumult. In the name of justice, where are the magistrates? An inquest was held for the death of George Herald, and fortunately for John Chaff, the jury felt the same as the paper, ruling the death as justifiable homicide. George Herald was buried in the churchyard at Sampford Peverell, and John Chaff continued his daily life, free from the worries of prosecution, until his death in 1845. So what was happening in Sampford Peverell during the autumn of 1810? Was there really a ghost haunting the premises of John Chaff, or was it all a big hoax? If it was, what had been the motive? There were some that suggested the motive was, of course, money. Some said that John made a pretty penny charging people to stay the night and see the ghostly manifestations for themselves. This is never mentioned by either Marriott nor Colton, but it does seem unlikely that John would simply have let seemingly dozens of the locals pile into his house for weeks on end for no profit at all. His suggestions, on the other hand, that he was losing money since no one could come to his shop after dark, did seem to fall somewhat flat when you consider this fact. Why were so many unwilling to go there to shop, but yet perfectly happy to spend the night on a ghostly vigil? There were also rumours that Mr. Tellamy, the landlord of the house, suspected John Chaff was simply carrying out a hoax with the intention of driving down the value of the house in order to secure a better deal for himself, or that he was doing it in order to settle a dispute over a bill of £9, which John had sent to Tellamy after he had had the house painted. If either of these had been true, however, the plan was a spectacular failure, given the outcome in regards to the riot that eventually saw John and his whole family leave the house shortly after. One of the earliest reports in the papers of the affair came from the Examiner on the 2nd of September, where they reprinted another report from the Taunton Courier. They did, however, write their own preamble, being the first to suggest the noises in the house may have had more to do with smugglers than any incorporeal spirit. It may be useful for the editor to know that in various places on the coast it has been no uncommon practice for smugglers to give out that certain houses have been haunted by evil spirits, and it really might be of some service in the elucidation of the affair if the excise officer was to take a peep into that same hollow depth about which the owner knows nothing. As Marriott pointed out, it seemed a fairly well-known fact that the old house had been known to have been used for smuggling in the past, and that a large cavity 6 feet deep under the floor in the upstairs rooms, accessed by a trapdoor covered with floorboards, did exist. A letter written by another clergyman from the area, written long after the affair, described the house as having double walls in places, with passages in between. It's curious that the Reverend Colton, in over 50 pages of rambling argument, never once tried to refute Marriott's claims that the house had been used for a well-known smuggling operation in the past, and that the affidavit he signed in the presence of the mayor included at best one lie, since he himself stated in his first pamphlet that the house contained at least one secret underfloor partition in the room next to the servant's bedroom. It's also curious that one of the key witnesses was an exciseman, and it's not too big of a stretch to consider a hoax may have been run by a smuggler who was using his shop as a side business and convenient cover, and a corrupt official cut in on the deal. It's a slightly larger leap to imagine that the Reverend was in on the game too, but he would not have been the first man of the cloth to have been involved in smuggling, and he certainly would not have been the last. Following the affair of the Sampford ghost, Reverend Colton moved away from Tiverton in 1812 when he was transferred to a vicarage in Kew before he left England entirely in 1828, fleeing from creditors. Setting himself up in Paris, his old habits quickly returned, and he set about making his fortune at the Palais Royal. And for once, he did appear to do rather well, amassing a fortune from winning bets, which he spent, like any good Parisian, collecting paintings and drinking wine. It all came crashing down eventually, and a losing streak saw him winding up as destitute once more. He moved back to England and lived off his family's kindness for several years before he eventually shot himself in 1832 in order to avoid an impending surgery, the thought of which had been causing him severe anxiety. Back in Sampford Peverell, the ghost never returned until the house at the centre of the story burnt down in 1942. The only sign that anything unusual had ever taken place there is a village information board, where it is referred to simply as the ghost house, now demolished. So that was the story of the Sampford Peverell ghost, and it's quite a twisty one, and we'll talk a little bit about that after these short advert breaks. Today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Do you ever find yourself comparing your life to others? Does social media play a part in that? And what do you do when you get caught up wishing your life looked like someone else's? Comparison can be the thief of joy, and it's really easy to envy other people's lives, especially with so much social media around. It might look like everyone's got it all together on their Instagram, but in reality, most people probably don't. Therapy can help you focus on what you want instead of what others have, so you can start living your best life. Therapy can benefit you in all sorts of ways. I've always advocated for talking therapy. I think it's a really good help for just about anything, really. I think, especially a few years back, people tended to think therapy was, only for people who were, really sick or really unwell or something. But actually, I think therapy can benefit everyone. It's like I say, I've always advocated for it. If you ever thought about starting therapy, why not give BetterHelp a try? It's entirely online, it's designed to be convenient, it's flexible, and it's suited to your schedule. You can just fill out a brief schedule, you get matched with a licensed therapist, and if you don't like that therapist, you can switch at any time for no additional charge. And then you can basically sit there in your pants on a Monday morning or a Friday evening, wherever you want, on Zoom, and have a session. So the accessibility is just brilliant. So stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/darkhistories today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/darkhistories. And the link for that's also in the show notes. Cheers. Welcome back. So the Sampford ghost. It's an interesting story. Say it's quite an obscure little story, but it's got some interesting turns which, do sort of elevate it above your normal ghost story. There's obviously the massive plot twist at the end, but there's a huge riot and he ends up shooting someone. It's sort of I guess it's not related to the story, but it's an interesting sort of footnote, I guess, to the story. But anyway, this is a complicated story, and it was difficult in many respects to research. It was quite easy to research in some respects because it was confined to a single village, and I found all the birth, death, and marriage records for the village in a single document. So that was quite handy. But it was difficult to research on in the respect that the main sources really of information for this are the pamphlets written by Marriott and Colton. And obviously they're terrible sources because they're both biased, obviously, for their own arguments, and not only that, they're clearly sort of at each other's throats, and so this kind of charged writing, it's not really useful. And on top of that, it's not in any sort of chronological order whatsoever. So, working out the chronology of the actual story is tough in itself. Anyway, that aside, the pamphlets, they're not the best of sources. They're incredibly biased. And in all honesty, you read both the pamphlets and neither sound particularly honest. They, like I said, they're both fighting their corner. I do think, and I have to say that the Reverend Colton comes out on top, especially with his second pamphlet. Marriott, I think when you read either pamphlet, they're quite convincing in a sense, like sort of when you read them separate from one another. But when you read them together, I do think Marriott comes across somewhat obsessive for championing the cause of the rationalists kind of thing, which there was certainly the case at the time. You had these newspaper editors that were really championing the cause, and so and he definitely falls under that moniker, right? And I think when you read his pamphlet, if you read it in isolation, like I say, it's quite a good piece, and I think he has some good theories, right? But then I think you read the rebuttal from the Reverend, and he really rips it apart, like almost line by line. He goes into the Marriott's pamphlet and just refutes like every single line, and gives, I think, like what sound like good reasons, or good excuses. There are a couple of times where he doesn't. For example, the brother-in-law who was supposedly Marriott accused him of being trained by this illusionist called Mr. Moon, right? Now, the Reverend, his reply to this is he was never trained by him, and to suggest that he was his student is like preposterous. He basically says, but then he says, I'm not going to say that he never met him. I'm not going to say that he never even talked about like how to play tricks. But to suggest that he was his student is just absurd. Which, okay, so where do we draw that line? Where are you drawing that line? It's an interesting sort of dance around the truth by the Reverend, that part. And like I said, I think, it's quite interesting the way he does that on many occasions. But generally speaking, he does, I think, come out on top. That's not to say that I believe it's a ghost. I think the smuggling angle is probably the best bet. And I think when you look at it, it all ties in. Like, so before Chaff moved in, there were lights seen in the house, and no one lived there at the time. So everyone just assumed it was haunted. Well, if you think about it, it was probably smugglers. There was probably smugglers in the house. It was known to have been operated before it had been emptied by smugglers. And so it was set up for a smuggler. So, it had the false walls, it had the false floor, it had like giant storage areas under the floor, things like that. And so I don't think it's too much of a leap to think that, well, if Chaff knew all this, would he not have rented that house for that precise reason? To become a smuggler or to maintain a smuggling operation. And then you start thinking, well, okay, who are the other people involved in this? One of the biggest witnesses is an excise officer. Well, that could work both ways. You could say, well, it's an excise officer, so he can't have been smuggling because he was, friends or acquaintances at least with this excise officer who spent quite a lot of time in the house investigating the ghost. But then you could say, well, also maybe the excise officer was in on it, because that wasn't uncommon. Bribing excise officers, getting them in on the gang, or getting them in on the on the take was completely normal behaviour. Then you think, what about the Reverend? How does the Reverend come into this? No, okay. Again, it's not the first time a clergyman was involved in smuggling. It was actually quite not common, but they were used as fronts a lot of times, because people, of course, went, well, we can't, suspect a clergyman, so therefore, they were good cover. I'm not suggesting that's the case here. I actually think that the Reverend probably wasn't aware of the smuggling, and I do think he just genuinely believed that it was haunted. I genuinely think that was the case. He seems so determined to prove that it is haunted, and I don't get the impression that he's coming at it from like a fanatic superstitionist or anything. I think it's almost like the reason he believes it so hard is because it surprised him as well. And so I don't think he's really in on it. I think he's probably like an innocent bystander, you might say. Now, of course, as the theory goes, this is entirely based on circumstantial evidence and assumptions and guesswork. We can never really know, but I do think it's quite a neat theory for everything. I don't know. What do you think? Let me know. My email is contact@darkhistories.com. You can get in touch with me there, obviously, and all social media and things like that. You can also get in touch via the website, which is darkhistories.com. There's all the ways to get in touch on there, and obviously all the links to things like the books, the merchandise, and any ways that you might want to support if you would like to support. Obviously, it's always greatly received. I mentioned it before, Dark Histories is just me. So, any support is always welcome. So, yes. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. It's a bit of an obscure one. It's quite a short one this week. It's there's not too much to it, but I do hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you found it interesting. And let me know if you've got any theories. As always, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, take care, sleep tight.